The ANC will rule until Jesus comes back. The political monopoly of the ANC has been broken. For the first time in South Africa's democratic history, the ANC, the party of Mandela, has decisively lost its majority, plummeting by 17 points to just 40% of the vote. Finally, after 30 years, the ANC has been held accountable for decades of corruption, soaring unemployment and crime rates, and nationwide blackouts. The era of one-party rule is over. The era of coalition politics has begun. How could the ANC score so badly? What led to the formation of a government of national unity? And can a new government rescue South Africa? All that in this video. Don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this. The fall of the ANC. Until now, the ANC has won every single election in South Africa since 1994 with decisive majorities, often well over 60%. And while this may seem baffling to outside observers, it's actually not that surprising. Not only are they the party responsible for bringing an end to the brutality of apartheid, but they also made some genuinely good achievements before the rot began to set in. The economy grew faster in the first 25 years of ANC rule than in the previous 25 years of apartheid. The ANC built over 3 million houses. Access to electricity increased from just 57% in 1996 to 90% today. Access to water went from 62% to 93%. Life expectancy increased from 53 to 62. A black middle class, 3.4 million strong, emerged where none had existed before and now outnumbers the white middle class. And a vast welfare state was constructed with over 17 million people benefiting from some kind of social welfare program. And this earned them the support of South Africa's black working class majority. But every election since 2004, when the ANC's support peaked at 69%, has seen the ANC's vote share precipitously drop as South Africans become more and more disillusioned with the promises made in 1994. The fact that the ANC could count on an almost guaranteed victory made the ANC arrogant, complacent, and corrupt. So much so that in 2008, Jacob Zuma declared that the ANC would rule until Jesus comes back. This resulted in increasing mismanagement of the country. Crime reached a 20-year high, with South Africa having the third highest murder rate in the world. The country's unemployment rate is the highest in the world at 33%, and South Africa is the most unequal country in the world. The state-owned companies expected to deliver basic services have collapsed due to corruption. SAA, the country's national airline, is bankrupt. Transnet, the national port and rail provider, is in a state of disrepair, and Eskom, in 2001 ranked as the best electricity company in the world, is now forced to implement load shedding, planned nationwide blackouts, because it simply can't produce enough power to meet the demand. This is the result of massive theft through corrupt procurement practices, illegal cartels operating within the company, and deliberate sabotage of the country's electricity infrastructure. And now the chickens have come home to roost, and the ANC has dropped to just 40% of the vote, down from 57% in 2019. This happened despite President Cyril Ramaphosa's attempt to sway voters by passing a haphazard universal healthcare law 2 weeks before the election without any way to pay for it, or the suspicious lack of power outages in the weeks before the election. Yet the traditional opposition parties have failed to capture the votes of disaffected ANC supporters. The second-place Democratic Alliance, or DA, got 22%, not much higher than their result in 2019. And this is because the center-right pro-business DA is largely seen as a party catering to the interests of white South Africans or the country's upper middle class. You see, in South Africa, 80% of the population is black, 9% is colored or mixed race, 8% is white, and 2.5% is Indian. And while the DA's voters don't only include whites, but also coloreds, Indians, and some middle-class blacks, it has failed to win the hearts of the vast working-class black majority that it would need to win the election. In fourth place, with 9%, are the Economic Freedom Fighters, or EFF, a radical left-wing offshoot of the ANC that promises radical redistribution from the wealthy white minority to the country's black majority. And while the EFF has grown at the expense of the ANC, it underperformed in this election, actually losing votes from 2019. This is for two reasons. Firstly, its stance on open borders, which simply doesn't fly in South Africa, where anti-immigration sentiment is very high. And secondly, because its shine was stolen by another anti-establishment party, the MK, Zuma's revenge. It's ironic that ex-President Jacob Zuma declared that the ANC would rule forever, because he has both directly and indirectly facilitated the fall of the ANC. Under his tenure, corruption grew way out of proportion, and the ANC grew increasingly unpopular, and he was eventually forced to step down in 2018 before his term was over, being replaced by Cyril Ramaphosa. Facing corruption charges, in 2021 he failed to turn up in court and he was arrested and jailed, which led to massive riots instigated by his supporters, which resulted in 354 dead and $3.4 billion of economic damage. After 2 months in prison, he was released on medical grounds. Having been disgraced and thrust out of power by his own ANC, Zuma would have his revenge, and so he backed the formation of a new political party, Umkhonto weSizwe, or Spear of the Nation, MK. This is not just any name, but in fact the name of the armed wing of the ANC during the anti-apartheid struggle. And in fact, the ANC tried to sue MK for copyright violation. Basically, the MK pitched itself as the party that would make good on the promises that the ANC failed to live up to. However, Zuma was barred from running for parliament by the courts because, he's a convicted criminal. So while he was technically not on the ballot, he essentially led the party's campaign. As a result, MK was able to secure almost 15% of the vote, coming in third place. Most of those votes came from kwa-zulu in eastern South Africa, which is majority ethnic Zulu, the same ethnicity as Zuma. Here's an ethnic map of South Africa. Here's the election map of South Africa. As you can see, the Zulu-speaking areas voted overwhelmingly for MK, or for the Inkatha Freedom Party, IFP, a Zulu traditionalist party. So essentially, Zuma has been able to mobilize the country's Zulu voters to oust the ANC from its majority status. In fact, in KwaZulu-Natal province specifically, MK scored over 45%, with the ANC relegated to third place at 17%. But it would be a mistake to think that this election is merely a Zulu ethnic backlash in favor of a disgraced ex-president Zuma. All across the country, people have abandoned the ANC in droves, and in 4 out of 9 provinces, the ANC is no longer in the majority. This means that at both the provincial and national levels, the ANC will be forced to go into coalitions, or in some provinces, even into the opposition, a government of national unity. After 30 years of dominant party rule, for the first time the ANC will be forced to seek coalition partners. Importantly, South Africa's president is indirectly elected. People vote for a party using proportional representation, and then parliament votes for the president, which means that Cyril Ramaphosa can only rise to the presidency once a coalition has been formed. On the 6th of June, President Cyril Ramaphosa announced that the ANC would seek to form a Government of National Unity, or GNU. This would be a coalition government with not just one party to get over 50%, but with as many parties as possible, bringing all willing opposition parties into government. As of 14 June, the centre-right Democratic Alliance, DA, Zulu Traditionalist Inkatha Freedom Party, IFP, and Anti-Immigrant Patriotic Alliance, PA, have agreed to join the GNU, while the radical left Economic Freedom Fighters, EFF, and Zuma's MK have refused to join. Now, this has happened before in South Africa. In the first democratic elections in 1994, the ANC won 62%, an absolute majority. Despite this, they agreed to form a government of national unity with all parties that got above 5% of the vote as a way of unifying a divided country after the fall of apartheid. And so the National Party, which represented whites with its 20% of the vote, and the Inkatha Freedom Party, which represented Zulus with its 10% of the vote, joined the ANC in government and took up ministerial posts, helping to heal, rebuild, and unify a divided country. A government of national unity in 2024 is a smart strategic move from Ramaphosa. Any coalition with just one of the major opposition parties is likely to divide the ANC from within, while opening them up to attacks from parties outside the coalition. But bringing in as many opposition parties as possible, different factions within the ANC can be satisfied. For instance, merely partnering up with the DA would open up the ANC to accusations of selling out to white big business interests, and likely cause them to lose votes to the radical EFF. But by bringing in smaller parties under the guise of a government of national unity, the ANC protects itself from criticism and doesn't have to concede as much in terms of policy, and gives all opposition parties a stake in the government and therefore less reason to challenge the ANC. It also means that when things inevitably go wrong or unpopular decisions have to be made, the ANC doesn't get all the blame, and opposition parties can't capitalize on failures, because they're in government too. At the same time, a GNU is more flexible than a traditional coalition, with participating parties supporting the government on budgets and government appointments, but still having the freedom to pursue their own ideological agenda. This is what makes it attractive for opposition parties to participate. A key component of the coalition agreement is that in order to pass anything, they need at least 60% support. In effect, this means that for anything to get passed, it needs the support of both the ANC and the DA, and that the ANC can't go around the DA and try and cobble together a majority on a certain policy with other smaller parties. This means that the DA is the most important partner in this coalition. A coalition with the DA would be most favored by international investors and business people, and would probably be the best thing for the economy and governance. The advantage of the DA is that it is the only other party with actual governing experience. The Western Cape province, which includes Cape Town, has been governed by the DA since 2009, and it is the best governed region of the country with the lowest unemployment rate, where infrastructure has been maintained better and corruption is lower. However, the DA has also been accused of mainly catering to the needs of its white middle-class voter base, neglecting the vast townships that surround Cape Town. Nevertheless, with 22% of the vote, the DA is in a strong negotiating position to have its demands met. Its leader, John Steenhuisen, would likely become vice president, and it might be able to curb some of the corruption of the ANC and implement some business-friendly policies to kickstart economic growth. For instance, the DA will demand the end of cadre deployment, a policy in which the ANC installed loyalist ANC party members into key positions in the civil service and state-owned companies instead of qualified people, leading to corruption, clientelism, and incompetence. However, such a move could undermine President Ramaphosa's position as corrupt ANC officials seek to protect their ill-gotten gains. But there are also deep policy disagreements. The DA wants to abolish the minimum wage, cut red tape, and cut the welfare state built by the ANC, which would alienate black working-class voters and lead to strong opposition from South Africa's powerful trade unions who back the ANC. While the ANC has declared that BEE, South Africa's version of affirmative action, and the NHI, a law introducing universal health insurance for all, are non-negotiable, the DA opposes both these policies. They also disagree on foreign policy, with the ANC launching the genocide case against Israel and supporting Palestine and alliances with BRICS nations like Russia and China, while the DA backs Israel and closer ties with the West. Whatever this coalition agrees on, South Africa's problems are so deep-rooted that they would both be blamed for whatever inevitably goes wrong. However, the advantage is that the voter bases of the DA and ANC don't really overlap, so even if they blame each other for the failures, they won't lose votes to each other. Also, at the provincial level, the ANC will be forced to share power with the DA, IFP, and other parties. In Gauteng, the economic heartland of South Africa, accounting for 1/3 of the country's GDP and containing cities like Johannesburg and Pretoria, the ANC got just 36%, which forced them to form a coalition with the DA in order to get an ANC provincial premier elected. In the Western Cape, the DA once again won an absolute majority at 53%, maintaining their control over the province. In KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa's main export terminal, despite MK being by far the biggest party at 45%, the IFP, ANC, DA and NFP have formed a grand coalition with a majority of just one seat, electing an IFP premier for the province, thereby leaving MK and EFF in opposition. This means that at both national and provincial level, Zuma has been kept out of the halls of power. When it comes to the GNU, President Ramaphosa has excluded parties that do not respect the constitution or the rule of law. He could be hinting at Zuma's MK party. After all, it was Zuma supporters who started the riots in 2021, which killed hundreds of people. It was the MK which threatened violence in the run-up to this election, and it is the MK that does not fully accept the result, despite the fact that they won so many votes. Perhaps Ramaphosa wants to use a GNU to isolate the MK and relegate them to irrelevancy. Finally, in the sparsely populated Northern Cape, the ANC only slipped slightly below a majority at 49%, which means that they can easily govern by recruiting a minor party. So in the three most economically developed and populous provinces in South Africa, Gauteng, Western Cape and KwaZulu-Natal, the ANC is either out of power or sharing it. Either way, a government of national unity could be what South Africa needs. It is the most democratic option, representing as many people as possible, while ensuring there is a broad consensus on reforms to fix the country. But what about the other options? Why didn't the ANC join a coalition with EFF or MK? The coalition of doom. So what about a coalition with the EFF? Well, technically a coalition with the EFF alone is not possible, as they would be 3 seats shy of a majority. However, they could get these seats by partnering with a few independents or a minor party like the Patriotic Alliance, which got 2% of the vote. Such a coalition would immediately scare investors and cause the currency to nosedive. The EFF was an offshoot of the ANC, led by former ANC Youth League leader Julius Malema. They support the nationalization of the banks and mines, expropriation of all white-owned land without compensation, Pan-Africanism, military support for Hamas, and open borders in Africa. These policies are so radical that they would most likely tank the economy, and the ANC would have a very hard time agreeing to them. The EFF has said that they are open to a coalition, but land redistribution is a must to gain their support, and they would demand that Julius Malema become vice president. This is an impossible ask. In order to expropriate land without compensation, they would have to change the constitution. But even if the ANC and EFF teamed up with MK, they would not have the 2/3 majority they would need in order to achieve this. In all likelihood, they would have to settle for a land redistribution policy more radical than the existing one, but significantly less radical than what the EFF is proposing. It's unlikely that they would pursue the most radical option favored by the EFF, because it would be economic suicide and because the EFF has less negotiating power. They would also have to contend with the demands of a third party. While the tough-on-crime Patriotic Alliance supports greater redistribution, much like the ANC and EFF, it is strongly anti-immigration and pro-Israel, the opposite of EFF, which is pro-Palestine and open borders. But what about the EFF joining the GNU? Well, the EFF refused to join any coalition that involves the DA, or what they call the representatives of white monopoly capital. That leaves MK. While MK supports many of the same radical policies of the EFF, its true purpose is for Zuma to hit back at the ANC and to get out of legal trouble. Unlike the other parties, MK's main demand was not a policy, but a presidential pardon for Jacob Zuma, who is currently facing over 700 corruption charges. This is something that the ANC might have granted had it not been for MK's other main demand. MK has also said that they are not open to working with the ANC as long as Ramaphosa remains president. In other words, MK demanded that in order to get their support, Ramaphosa steps down in favor of his vice president, Paul Mashatile. But that was a bridge too far, and Ramaphosa would never accept this. Add to that the fact that MK is still contesting election results, and a coalition with them is out of the question. So what would a hypothetical ANC-led coalition need to do to save South Africa from its current state of economic decline? Rescuing South Africa. South Africa is beset by a mountain of problems, from sky-high unemployment and crime rates to institutionalized corruption, failing public services, and nationwide blackouts. The most important step is for the state capture, corruption, and clientelism that has been allowed to fester under the ANC to be rolled back. Without eliminating corruption, no policy package, whatever its ideological flavor, can hope to succeed. This will require the ANC's coalition partners and opposition parties to hold it accountable. This will require the rebuilding of South Africa's institutions, like reintroducing the Scorpions, a specialized anti-corruption unit within the police that was disbanded by Jacob Zuma. But more importantly than that, for ordinary South Africans to get involved. That means the media exposing corruption. It means civil servants whistleblowing. It means civil society demanding accountability, and it means the courts doing their job and prosecuting corrupt officials. When it comes to policy, the new government will have to fix South Africa's failing state-owned companies and rebuild the country's infrastructure. That means allowing alternative electricity producers to reduce load shedding and end the monopoly of Eskom. A big part of this means ending South Africa's dependency on dirty coal and embracing the vast solar power potential in the country, which can easily be exploited by independent producers rather than a failing state-owned company. A new government must appoint competent, non-partisan people to run Eskom and other state-owned enterprises, and these enterprises should have minimum requirements in terms of revenue generation and financial viability, or they should just be sold off. Without adequate electricity or infrastructure, businesses can't operate in South Africa, and the economy will continue to decline and unemployment will continue to increase. The new government must also deal with South Africa's horrific inequality, which is also the source of its horrific crime rates. While one can disagree with the radical policies of the EFF, the party feeds on a very real sentiment that for a great many people, economic apartheid is still very much a reality. Today in South Africa, 10% of the population owns more than 80% of the wealth, and much of that 10% is white. Some kind of redistribution policy is needed that can level the playing field without harming the wider economy. This could include simplifying the welfare system into a universal basic income grant, fixing the country's education system so that people can lift themselves out of poverty, and redesigning the country's urban landscape so that apartheid-era urban design that relegates poor black people to the outskirts of cities is no longer replicated. When it comes to land distribution, 72% of South Africa's agricultural land is still controlled by whites, despite the ANC's 1994 promise to redistribute at least 30% of the land. The problem is that too little land has been redistributed, and what has been redistributed has not gone to people capable of maintaining the same productivity levels. The new government should significantly expand and subsidize agricultural colleges for rural black South Africans and designate these graduates as beneficiaries for any kind of land redistribution program. South Africa is a deeply flawed democracy. Corruption has extended its tentacles deep into the South African state, and it will take more than just one election defeat to change that. But the election has also shown that it is still a democracy. There is still an independent media, independent courts, a vibrant and defiant civil society, and real elections with real consequences. Monopolies are bad, both in economics and in politics. They produce complacency and poor performance. But the political monopoly of the ANC has decisively been broken, and that can only mean hope for South Africa. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe and consider becoming a Patreon to support the channel. Leave a comment for the algorithm. Thank you to my Patreons for making this video possible. Like, share, and subscribe, because this was my take.